So, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks to David for writing the book and for everyone else for creating this event. A few thoughts on the book. First, a couple of points that just what I really liked about the book. One was it's just a pleasure to read. It really is a pleasure to read. It's unusual in my field to pick something up that's a pleasure to read and that goes relatively quickly. You know, you sort of normally before you read something you have to kind of like steel yourself for some hard slog, and that was not like this. And I really just it's hard to do, and I really appreciated it. So that's A, and it's not a small thing by any means. And then two, it's a brave book. The dominant paradigm in corporate law is sort of shareholder wealth maximization. And this is not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily contradicting that, but it's certainly not written in with that coming from that perspective. And I think that takes some courage to go ahead and do that. And I think David deserves a lot of credit in that. We don't see that much of this type of stuff in corporate law. So with that said, I'm going to make 3 points that I think are complementary to what to David's goals in the book, perhaps for future work, and things that I think kind of use his prodigious skills in ways that I think will help all of us. So one point is, and the really great thing about labor as a shareholder is that, to me, it really emphasizes kind of the weirdness of, especially at the margins, of shareholder wealth maximization. So it's, we have when a worker is also a shareholder. So it's very clear that they have multiple interests with respect to the corporation. They have their interest in the future dividends of the corporation, of course. But then they have multiple other interests, namely their position as a worker. And in particular, if we argue that there are contractual protections to this second interest or all these other interests are incomplete, then it's entirely plausible for a worker to say, no, I don't want to get an extra 2 cents of dividends. I want to keep my job, and I want my friends to keep my job. And that it's very clear that like that's rational. Like that, it would be weird for them to say, no, I just want the little bit extra. So, and I think so it's a really great example of how sort of the kind of fiction, the plausible fiction we tell ourselves with shareholder wealth maximization is flawed. And in terms of where to go, sort of point one, I might encourage David to, in the future, sort of push harder on this. I think that a lot of given the asymmetry between like the power of the paradigm and its sort of empirical relevance, I thought that a lot of the examples in the book were relatively tame. So it sort of sounded like, there's this like arresting insight, which is that shareholders should, that labor as shareholders should be maximizing all sorts of things potentially. And then it sounded a lot like, to what end should they be doing this? To something a lot like what Lucian Bebchuk would sign up to or something like that, in terms of share. And like, I'm not saying I disagree, but it doesn't, if shareholder wealth maximization is the problem, we should have more emphatic conclusions. Like almost every, I think there are much bigger problems than sort of the kind of standard conflict between management and shareholders that we talk about in corporate law. So like, for example, I'm very interested in why, even though corporate returns have been unbelievably high for the last, I don't know how many years, investment has not been high. And even though interest rates have been very low. And, and it's just, that's not a problem. No one has a good explanation for this. But I think like this is the type of thing that this type of move could start to address. Because I would imagine that investment would be very popular with unions in general, just because like it's jobs. And just to give an example that is kind of near and dear to my heart because I look at it almost every day. In New Haven, as in most places in the U.S., sort of as of late 2008, construction just ground to a halt. Like the university and everyone else just stopped, maybe they continued what sort of needed to be continued, but there were no new shovels in the ground. And in New Haven, there's one exception, and it's called 360 State Street, and it's the tallest building in New Haven. And what it was it's a labor pension fund. It's like 80% equity. They kind of came in and said, we'd like to develop this residential building. They were able to get, because they had literally every sort of construction worker in the county kind of coming and saying, please approve this building. They were able to build probably 10 or 15 stories higher than they might have been otherwise. And it's been an unbelievably successful building. And it's sort of, and I think like when the head of this investment fund, he made it very clear that like a return was like his number one motivation, but he had many motivations. And I think like that was for at least those workers, that was a transformative investment. It also happens to have been probably the best real estate investment in New Haven in the last 50 years. I'm not exaggerating, but let's leave that aside. So I think like that's sort of, it's one town, but like that's the type of thing that I think is possible in a way that it wouldn't have been possible for other people. So that's one. Two, and this is quite related, is with respect to, I think in future work, David should be clearer about whether he wants, so a shareholder's interest has sort of two components. It's their right to voice, just shareholder activism, sort of governance. But then there's also sort of what David calls the Wall Street walk, where you just, if you really don't like what's happening, rather than just complaining, you sell and you move on. And David, in most of the book, I think it's fair to say, it seems like you're more interested in activism, in sort of like exercising voice in a way that promotes the union's broader interests. And I'm very sympathetic to that goal. And but I think it might be more powerful over the long run to exercise, to walk, to start, saying you're going to vote against a CEO is something, but sort of not investing is another thing entirely. And David says a few times in the book, I think in chapter 6, that this will reduce diversification if you're not investing in certain corporations. And that's true, but actually the numbers on what you need for diversification are really, like once you get sort of 30 or 40 firms, the benefits to diversification really hit into like super diminishing returns. So you can, 500 firms is somewhat more diversified than 30 or 40, but you'd be amazed at how little it is. So that can't be the reason not to do it. And that is something that would be very powerful. Sort of along those lines, if another fear that David mentions a lot, is unions spending too much. It's not crazy for them to, and it sounds like CalPERS is heading in this direction, to have their own management, where they're less concerned about all of these things. It'd be one thing if I thought that hedge funds were providing sort of alpha. But I don't think that. So my fear of leading investments astray, so long as they continue to be diversified and that kind of thing, I think the power of the tool could be enormous, and I can understand why you wouldn't want to. You're already being brave. You don't want to push farther, but I just think that that's something important. So that's 2. And then 3 has to do with the last chapter, which was on public pension fund or public pension benefit reform. And I thought that I wasn't sure exactly how that fit in with the rest of the book, because I think one can be sort of very much pro sort of exercising shareholder power in new ways without necessarily being pro defined benefit pension funds or defined benefit retirement plans. Like they don't seem necessarily they don't necessarily seem to be the same thing to me, or necessarily all that similar. And in fact, like from my personal perspective, I don't have strong priors at all about like who should bear the risk of pensions being too generous, whether it should be the workers or the taxpayers. It's not obvious to me, and so I thought like some of that last chapter was necessarily everyone may not necessarily have bad motives. I'm sure there are bad motives with some of the funds, but another way of describing some of the fear about public pension fund promises is just another way of saying, like, if you were concerned about your jurisdiction accumulating excessive debt, and you don't have to be nefarious to be worried about taking on a lot of debt obligations. So that I think I just wasn't sort of sure through reading that chapter exactly how that fit in with everything else. But broadly speaking, again, it was a pleasure to read, and I think like if labor really wanted to use this tool to push this tool, I think it could be much more than like a governance tool, and it could be sort of something, especially given the amount of money there. It could do incredible things. So that might be the next book for you. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.